your full support?
Well, earlier this morning I saw some correspondence between Nick Smith in his capacity as Minister of ACC and another Member of Parliament that was advocating for the complainant. What was clear was that this Member of Parliament made the point that they were acting on behalf of another Member of Parliament because that person had a conflict, and that the Minister at the time, the Associate Minister of ACC, who had ministerial authority for case management, also felt that they had a conflict of interest and therefore had passed the responsibility back to Nick Smith. Now, what's quite clear is that Nick Smith should have recognised that he had a conflict of interest himself and should have made that clear and shouldn't have taken any responsibility. I think that was an error of judgment which he would agree, when coupled with the reference that he wrote, meant that he had effectively erred twice. It's my view that Nick Smith has acted legally, and I don't think he's tried to influence ACC officials, but he has erred in terms of his judgment on two occasions. On that basis, he offered his resignation, and I accepted it.
That other letter was a minor.
Did his relationship, his personal relationship with Bronwyn Puller, have any influence on your decision to accept his resignation?
No, I mean, look, I was aware yesterday that he had a friendship with the complainant, so that was in my thinking yesterday. Yesterday I was very disappointed in Nick Smith. I mean, I believe that in writing the reference that he was pretty close to the line, that he had used unwise judgment in writing a reference. But I balance that up against everything else that he had done as a minister in a long and distinguished career. And so on balance, I believe that that was acceptable. But what came about today is clear evidence that it's not just once that he showed poor judgment, it's twice. And on that basis, it's quite clear he should have made his conflict of interest also known. He shouldn't have had anything to do with the complainant. He should have delegated that responsibility as other ministers do. The Cabinet guidelines are quite clear about a perception of a real or perceived conflict of interest, and on that basis, I accepted his resignation.
Prime Minister, that other letter was in minor. That other letter was in minor league compared to the one that came out yesterday. It was a minor transgression.
I would totally disagree with that.
Well, the one that came out yesterday was a reference. The other one was totally in the minor league.
I disagree with that.
Is this just a way of getting you off the hook for not making a decision about this yesterday?
No. In my view, as I said, if you look at the situation in relation to the writing of the reference, that is an error in judgment. I think it was unwise. I made that clear to the Minister yesterday and accepted his apology. It's a vastly different proposition when you couple that with the situation that he was essentially acting in an advocacy capacity in what is a delegated authority he had given to an associate minister who had rightfully said that she had a conflict of interest. The minister should have recognised he also had a conflict of interest. So it's a combination of two. Maybe one error would have been okay, but two errors is one error too many.
So you seen that other letter by the time you spoke to us this morning?
I saw it earlier this morning.
Have you talked to him about the nature of his relationship with Bronwyn Puller?
I haven't at length. I'm aware that they are friends. I don't need to know the details of that friendship. You either have a conflict of interest or you don't, and he clearly had a conflict of interest. The nature of the relationship is not really material.
You stood in front of us this morning, Mr. Key, and you told us you fully supported Dr. Smith at the time. You'd seen that other letter.
At that time.
But you had seen the other letter at that stage.
Yeah, well, we go through a process. I hadn't actually spoken to Dr. Smith. I wanted to do that. Most people would appreciate that this is a senior minister. I think it's important to that there's natural justice, and I talked through those issues with ministers. I put a phone call into him. He was in a meeting in Dunedin. Once I came out from the meeting we had this morning, I had the opportunity to have a conversation.
So you're saying you would have sacked him? Are you saying you would have sacked him this morning?
In him at that time.
Sorry?
Were you telling us the truth when you told him that you had confidence in him at that time?
At that time, because it's necessary for me to go in a good process to talk with ministers. There may have been a reasonable explanation. I couldn't see that explanation, and it worried me, of course. I would take that matter up with them. But I think most people would be realistic and say when you have a senior minister whose job might be on the line, that you would actually have a conversation with them and have a good process. I'm not going to make apologies for that. It's the right process to follow.
Prime Minister, you say you saw the other letter this morning and you were passing confidence in it. Are you saying that you would have sacked him?
Well, there's a hypothetical question.
Well, no, it's not. It's a realistic question. You've
It's a
seen both
hypothetical-
letters,
it's a
but you had
hypothetical-
confidence in it.
It's a hypothetical question.
Why?
He offered his resignation, and I accepted it.
No, that's not
Did
right.
you want him to resign?
Would you have sacked
When you
him?
spoke,
Can you
did
say
you
whether you would have
Did you want
sacked
him
him?
to resign this morning?
No need to shout.
No, well, I'm asking
And
you. Well, you don't
there's
have
no
as a
shout.
question.
There's
That's the
no shout.
problem.
There's no shout.
Okay, would you
Barry,
have
there's
sacked
no
him?
need to shout.
Would you have sacked
Mate,
him?
what I'm telling you is he offered his resignation. If he hadn't offered his resignation, well, who knows, but we're not going to go into hypothetical questions. He offered his resignation.
Did anyone
from your
urge him?
staff ask Dr. Smith or suggest to him that he should resign?
No,
Did
He
you get
was
advice from the
heading to
Cabinet
Nelson
Office today on the matter?
I did, yes.
He was heading to Nelson today originally. Was he directed by your office to return here and effectively play some music?
No, but I mean, I thought it made sense once I had the conversation with him. He was in Christchurch. I landed about 11:30. I had a conversation with him sometime between then and about 12 o'clock. At that point, he said to me that he wanted to offer his resignation. I told him that I was accepting his resignation. I thought that made sense because I believe he'd erred badly in his judgment, and it was appropriate that he do that. At that point, he said, "Look, I think I'll come back to Wellington." I said, "I think that's absolutely appropriate."
Why are you happy
Minister
for...
this term?
Look, it is possible, but I won't cross that bridge if I ever came to it.
Why are you happy for him to remain a Member of Parliament?
Because I don't believe that he has done something illegal. I think he has created the perception of a conflict of interest, and it's clearly in breach of the Cabinet Manual. I think in making the decision to essentially advocate for the claimant, even though he makes it clear in the letters that she is known to him and that she's a friend, essentially allowing himself to be in that position and write a reference is not good judgment, and ministers are expected to show good judgment. But I think there's a big difference between that and somebody actually doing something that's illegal or attempting to effectively screw the scrum, if you like. I don't think he actually tried to do that, but I think he exercised very poor judgment.
Which of
Would
the
you
two
consider
letters, Prime Minister,
reinstating
which of the
him?
two letters was in breach of the Cabinet Manual?
The first probably was on a
Well, you
closer
said
reading.
yesterday it was.
Yeah, look, I went and had a little bit of a read last night, but the Cabinet Manual's a guide, and there's no specific part of the Cabinet Manual that absolutely says that you can't write a reference. But I think if you put the two together, in my view, it's a breach of the Cabinet.
Would you consider reinstating him as a minister?
Well, there are always discussions with senior ministers, so I have those discussions with them. But in the end, the decision to offer his resignation was Mr. Smith's. The decision to accept his resignation was mine.
But did anyone else sort of maybe not want you to accept his resignation?
I wouldn't go into
Do you
those.
regret not seeking advice from the Cabinet Office yesterday on this matter?
No, because look, if that had been an isolated incident yesterday, I wouldn't have expected Dr. Smith to offer his resignation, because in my opinion, the writing of the reference, while it was very unwise, while it was a poor use of judgment, has to be seen in the context of everything else he's done. But once you start putting the component parts together, it's a different picture.
So you would have been happy for him to breach the Cabinet Manual in that case?
Well, ministers
stay on.
can breach a Cabinet Manual. They do. It's a guide. Helen Clark made that quite clear in Parliament on numerous occasions. What I would say to you is, as a general rule, it's not a book that's used to sack ministers. It is guidance for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on how they act. And in my view, I had very close reading. Look, he probably was in breach last night. I think he's definitely in breach in terms of the reading today. But in the end, the most fundamental point is the perception of a conflict of interest. I think he was pretty marginal yesterday, but the combination of the two makes a difference.
Is there a chance he'd be reinstated as a minister at any time in the future?
It's possible, but that's not on my radar.
Have you done a deal? Have you done a deal with him? Helen Clark, she laid off a number of ministers and brought them back. Have you done a similar deal with Nick
No,
Smith?
there's no deal.
And wisdom leaders says that these were clear conflicts and they were disregarded because, as he turns out, National Party elite has too much sway and influence and this is them looking after each other.
But I'd reject that.
So what was the specific advice that you got from the Cabinet Office?
Look, I'd have to go and pull that out. It's not written advice, it was oral advice to me, so I wouldn't want to paraphrase it.
So how will you pull it out if it's oral
Well,
advice?
I could go and ask them to give it to me again, but don't.
Can't you remember it?
Well, I can remember it in so much that I don't have the exact wording, but there is no specific breach, if you like, in terms of there's no specific clause about the writing of a reference.
On ministerial letterhead?
There are references to the perception of a conflict of interest.
Well, Minister, you say that you don't believe it was an attempt to screw the scrum, but this woman was involved in a dispute with ACC, essentially over her condition before her accident, as Dr. Smith told us before.
Yeah.
His letter is blatantly an attempt, is going to bat for her, saying that her condition was, she was in good condition.
Which letter are you talking about?
I'm talking about the reference.
Oh, no, I think the reference actually was an attempt by him to say, look, he knew her prior to the accident. At the time that he knew her prior to the accident, she was in good health as best as he could assess, recognising he's not a health professional. I think that's actually reasonable. The issue in relation to the second letter is that he has essentially delegated responsibility to an associate minister, and delegating the responsibility, that's the right thing to do. But the associate minister has recognised that she had a conflict of interest because the complaint was on her campaign committee, has essentially gone back to the minister and said, I can't look after this in terms of case management because I have a conflict of interest. Well, it's quite clear the minister himself had a conflict of interest. He should have recognised that at the time. And I think if you put the two together, then that's the worrying factor.
The reference went to the heart of her dispute with ACC, though, and he was the ACC minister. It's an open and shut case, isn't it?
Well, in my view, no. I mean, I think there's a lot of particular issues around this case. I mean, it's a long-standing dispute. I don't claim to understand all of the issues in relation to her complaint, other than that she believes she's not getting a fair deal from ACC and hasn't believed she's had a fair deal for a very long period of time. He provided a piece of written documentation supporting her health condition prior to the accident. That's actually quite different from being the minister that responded to another parliamentarian's inquiry about her case when he's the minister and when he's delegated responsibility.
Will you have a cabinet reshuffle now?
Responsibilities now?
There'll be a new minister, but I'm not sure how significant the reshuffle will be.
Who will that new minister be?
I haven't made that decision yet. I mean, I wasn't really expecting to be in this position when I went to bed last night, so I'll think about during the next few days.
Were you really not expecting to be in this position when you went to bed last night?
I was quite comfortable with the decision I made yesterday. As I said, I think you erred on the side of sort of unwise judgment yesterday. I think it created potential perception, but in my view, in the context of everything else, I was prepared to accept that as a one-off error. But I think when you look at all the other things, I think the minister did the right thing in offering his resignation.
So you've made quite a big deal about saying that the bar that you're setting for your ministers is a lot higher than perhaps there has been in other years. So what does this do, given that you didn't think it was a serious enough breach yesterday when he'd written a reference on ministerial letterhead of a portfolio that he represents over an issue that she was seeking help with?
Well, people can judge that for all they like. I mean, that's the way it will be. If there was a whole lot of instances and there wasn't some consequences, and then I think people would draw some conclusions from that. But actually, people would also look, I think, and say that ministers are human. From time to time they make mistakes, just like journalists. They from time to time make mistakes, and they're not sacked every single time they make a mistake. If they were, a lot of journalists wouldn't be there. So on balance, employers always go and look at the whole range of issues that are there. And in my view, in isolation, it was a bad mistake from Dr. Smith yesterday, but in the context of everything, not necessarily enough for him to lose his warrant. But when you look at the situation today, then I think in combination he did the right thing to offer his resignation.
But it wasn't even enough to stand him down and have a good look at what had happened.
Well, I don't think that was necessary, and I still don't think an inquiry is necessary because, frankly, we understand what's gone on.
Dr. Smith said he'd quite like to see an inquiry.
Yeah, he would. Look, I mean, I understand that, and that's because he is very vehemently of the view that he hasn't done anything that's actually wrong, but he certainly accepts he's created the perception of a conflict of interest. And as I said to you, I don't believe he's a person that's acted illegally. I don't think he's deliberately tried to influence this process. I think if you look at all of the correspondence, he's quite clear about spelling out the friendship that he has with this particular person. But ministers have to try and avoid either real or potential conflicts of interest. And in accepting the advocacy of this case, essentially, he has made an error of judgment in doing that.
So there will be no review.
Well, the Privacy Commissioner and the police are having their inquiries, and they'll carry on in the fullness of time. I haven't seen anything else that strikes me that I don't feel I understand what's going on in this particular instance.
Winston Peters says that he's known about this for some time. When did you know about the conflict?
He just makes things up as he goes along, doesn't he? I mean, honestly. As I said in the House, on Monday I found out about the reference, and obviously I was disappointed with that discussion with the Minister on Tuesday morning, or maybe Monday night, but certainly Tuesday morning. On this morning I found out about the letter.
So ministers in the future who make similar or other kinds of mistakes maybe can be expected to be cut a little bit of slack now?
I'm not going to draw judgment. Every single case I've had to deal with as Prime Minister has been different. And so, on balance, like a normal employer, we look at all of those facts. And I'll continue to do that. What I can say is I think if you look at the record in 3.5 years of this government and the way it's dealt with ministers who have erred, the standard is higher than under the Clark administration.
But then did you deal with this as Prime Minister? You let him resign. You weren't going to sack him.
I didn't say that. I said that's a hypothetical question. I didn't.
So if he hadn't resigned, you would have sacked him?
You're asking a hypothetical question I don't need to answer because he resigned.
Did you tell him to resign?
No.
No one in your office told him to resign?
No.
Or suggested it?
No.
You said you weren't made aware of either letter before your cabinet reshuffle, before Monday.
Yeah.
Was your office made aware of it?
No.
Was
Not
evidence that
prove it.